Most people don't fail because they're lazy, they fail because they don't have a system. That was the sentence running through Ryan Parker's head as he stood in front of the glass doors at 6:58 a.m., staring at his own reflection like it belonged to someone else, someone who almost had his life together but never quite did, his phone buzzing in his pocket with another reminder he'd ignore, another goal he wouldn't finish, another promise he'd break to himself before the day even started. And the worst part wasn't the failure anymore. It was how normal it felt, like drifting in the same circle over and over again, watching months turn into years without anything real to show for it. And he told himself this time would be different, just like he had last week, and the week before that. But deep down he already knew how the day would end. Unfinished tasks, quiet guilt, and that heavy silence at night, when there's no one left to blame but yourself. Until everything changed the moment he met Ethan Cole, a man who didn't look like anything special at first glance, just a carpenter in a worn denim shirt standing in a small workshop that smelled like sawdust, and something oddly grounding, steady, like time moved differently inside those walls. And when Ryan tried to explain how he just needed motivation, just needed the right push, Ethan didn't nod, didn't encourage him, didn't give him a speech. He just looked at him and said, "Motivation is useless if you can't keep a promise to yourself." And then after a pause that felt heavier than it should have, he added, 30 days, Ryan. That's all it takes. But there's one rule. You miss one day, you start over. And something about the way he said it made Ryan uneasy. Like this wasn't another hack or shortcut or inspirational quote he could forget tomorrow. This was something else, something strict, something unforgiving. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan didn't argue, didn't make excuses, he just nodded, even though a part of him already knew how hard it would be. Because deep down he wasn't afraid of the work, he was afraid of what it would mean if he failed again. But what he didn't realize yet was that this wasn't just about finishing goals, it was about becoming the kind of person who actually finishes what he starts. Day one started before the sun came up, and Ryan hated it already. The alarm cutting through the quiet at 5:30 in the morning like a reminder of every version of himself that had failed before, his body heavy, his mind already negotiating, telling him he could start tomorrow, telling him one more day would not matter. But then he remembered Ethan's voice, calm and unyielding. Miss one day, and you start over. And that rule felt different. It did not sound like motivation, it sounded like a line in the sand. So he forced himself out of bed, every movement slow, mechanical, like he was dragging a version of himself forward that did not want to go. And the first task was simple. Write down one goal, and take one action toward it. No matter how small, no excuses. And Ryan sat at his kitchen table staring at a blank notebook for almost 10 minutes before finally writing something down. Not perfect, not impressive, just real. And that was the first crack in the pattern he had been living in, because for once he was not planning or dreaming. He was doing, even if it felt insignificant, even if no one else would ever see it. And the rest of the day did not magically improve. It was messy, uncomfortable, filled with moments where he wanted to quit, but he did not. And that alone felt strange, like breaking a habit he did not realize had control over him. And day two was worse, because now there was pressure. Now he had something to protect, and the temptation to skip was louder, more convincing, telling him he had already proven something by starting, telling him consistency was optional. But again that rule came back. Miss one day, and you start over. And suddenly skipping was not neutral anymore. It had a cost. And Ryan realized for the first time that the method was not about effort. It was about consequence. And that changed everything. Because now every small decision carried weight. Every choice mattered in a way it never had before. And by day three the resistance hit its peak, his energy low, his mind restless. Everything inside him pushing back against the structure. And he caught himself reaching for his phone, ready to waste another hour, ready to slide back into the version of himself he knew too well. And he paused, just for a second, long enough to ask himself a question he had never taken seriously before. Am I the kind of person who keeps promises to myself? And the answer was uncomfortable, but it was also clear. And for the first time Ryan understood that this was not about finishing a task. It was about confronting who he had been every single day up until now, and deciding if he was willing to change that, even when it felt difficult, even when no one was watching, even when it would be easier to quit. And that realization did not feel exciting. It felt heavy, but it also felt real, like something had finally shifted beneath the surface, something deeper than motivation, something that might actually last. By day 4, the excitement of starting was gone, replaced by something far more difficult to deal with, a quiet, persistent resistance that followed Ryan everywhere, sitting with him at the table, walking with him through the day, whispering that none of this really mattered, that small actions would not change anything, that he was still the same person no matter what he wrote in that notebook each morning. And for a moment, he almost believed it, because the results were still invisible. Nothing dramatic had happened, no sudden breakthrough, no external validation, just effort layered on top of effort with no immediate reward. And that was the point where he had always stopped before, the place where most people stop, when the work feels disconnected from the outcome, when progress is too small to notice and too slow to celebrate. But this time there was something different, not motivation, not even confidence, but a growing awareness that the discomfort itself was part of the process, that the method was designed to feel like this, to strip away the need for quick results and force him to operate without them. And that realization did not make it easier, but it made it clearer, and clarity gave him just enough reason to continue. And by day 5 he began to notice something subtle, not in his results, but in his behavior. The hesitation before quitting was longer, the internal negotiation weaker, and the act of following through, even on something small, felt slightly more natural, like a pattern slowly rewriting itself. And then day 6 tested him in a different way, not through exhaustion or doubt, but through distraction, a long day filled with interruptions, unexpected tasks, and the kind of chaos that used to give him an easy excuse to skip everything. And for a moment he almost did, convincing himself that today did not count, that he could make up for it tomorrow. But the rule did not change. It never adjusted to his schedule or his mood. Miss one day, and you start over, and that forced him to confront a truth he had avoided for years, that inconsistency was not caused by lack of time. It was caused by lack of commitment, and that idea stayed with him as he sat down late that night, tired, unfocused, and still chose to complete the smallest version of his task. Not perfectly, not impressively, but completely. And when he closed the notebook, something shifted again, not externally, but internally, a quiet sense of control that had been missing for a long time. And by day 7, he realized that the method was no longer something he was trying to follow. It was something that was starting to shape him, forcing him to show up when he did not feel like it, to act when there was no immediate reward, and to keep a promise even when it would be easier to break it. And that was when he understood the first real truth of the system, that success was not built on intensity, it was built on consistency. And consistency was not something you waited to feel ready for, it was something you proved through action, one day at a time. By day 8, the routine was no longer new, and that was exactly what made it dangerous, because the mind no longer resisted loudly, it adapted quietly, replacing doubt with subtle shortcuts, small compromises that felt harmless in the moment, like telling himself he could do less today because he had done enough yesterday, or that starting later would not matter as long as he finished something. And Ryan almost did not notice it happening, because it did not feel like failure, it felt reasonable. And that was the most deceptive part, because the method was not designed to fight obvious excuses, it was designed to expose the hidden ones, the kind that sound logical but slowly break consistency over time. And on day 9, he caught himself doing exactly that, sitting at the table later than usual, telling himself he would still complete the task, just with less effort, just enough to say he did it. And for a moment he accepted it, until something in him paused, recognizing that this was the same pattern that had kept him stuck for years, lowering the standard just enough to feel comfortable while still pretending to move forward. And that realization hit harder than any failure, because it showed him that the real challenge was not starting or even continuing. It was maintaining integrity when no one else was watching. And so he reset his focus, not by doing more, but by doing exactly what he had committed to, no shortcuts, no adjustments. And that decision felt small in action, but significant in meaning, because it marked the first time he chose discipline over convenience without hesitation. And by day 10 something unexpected began to happen, not in his results, but in his perception of effort. Tasks that had felt heavy before now felt neutral, almost automatic, not easy, but no longer overwhelming. and he realized that consistency had started to reduce resistance, not by making the work easier, but by making the decision to act less negotiable. And that was a shift he had never experienced before. Because in the past, every action required motivation, required a reason, required a push, but now the action came first and the feeling followed. And by day 11, he began to trust the process in a way he had not allowed himself to before, not because he saw proof, but because he felt stability, a sense that for once his behavior was not controlled by mood or circumstance. And that stability created a quiet confidence, not loud or dramatic, but steady, like something finally locking into place after being loose for too long. And on day 12, he noticed the first external sign of change, something small but undeniable, a task completed earlier than expected, a result that reflected his effort in a way he could measure. And it was not the outcome itself that mattered. It was what it represented, proof that consistent action, even when imperfect, could produce real progress. And that was the moment the method revealed its second truth, that results are not created by intensity or talent. They are created by repetition, by showing up again and again until the process itself begins to compound. And Ryan understood that if he could protect this pattern, if he could continue without breaking the chain, then the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was only a matter of time. By day 13, Ryan started to believe he understood the system, and that belief was exactly what put him at risk, because confidence, when it came too early, had a way of turning discipline into assumption and assumption into mistakes, and it happened quietly, almost invisibly, when he woke up that morning and thought, just for a second, that he had earned the right to relax, that the past 12 days proved he could handle it, that missing one small detail or delaying one task would not really matter anymore. And that was the moment the pattern tried to return, not as failure, but as overconfidence. And throughout the day he felt it, the subtle pull to ease up, to loosen the structure that had been holding everything together. And by the time evening came, he was tired, mentally drained, and the idea of completing his task felt heavier than it had in days. Not because it was harder, but because he had allowed his focus to drift. And for the first time since he started, he hesitated longer than usual, sitting in silence, staring at the notebook, telling himself he could make up for it tomorrow. And that thought almost won, because it sounded reasonable, it sounded earned, but then something deeper pushed back, a realization that hit him with a clarity he could not ignore, that the moment you believe you deserve to break the rule is the exact moment the system stops working. And that insight cut through every excuse he had, forcing him to see that this was not about effort anymore. It was about identity, about whether he was someone who followed through only when it felt justified or someone who followed through no matter what. And that distinction changed the weight of the decision entirely, because now it was not about finishing a task. It was about choosing who he was becoming. And so he picked up the pen, not with energy or motivation, but with intention. And he completed the work exactly as he had committed to. No shortcuts, no reductions. And when he finished, there was no excitement, no celebration, just a quiet sense of alignment, like something inside him had held its ground under pressure. And that was the real progress, not the task itself, but the ability to stay consistent even when the mind tried to justify inconsistency. And by day 14, he understood something new, something that had been invisible before, that the hardest part of growth is not starting or even continuing. It is maintaining standards. When you begin to feel comfortable, because comfort is where discipline begins to weaken, and that awareness made him sharper, more intentional, less likely to negotiate with himself. And as he moved through the day, completing each action with the same level of commitment, he realized that the method was not just building habits. It was building resilience against his own tendencies, the tendency to drift, to relax too soon, to assume progress was permanent when it was still fragile. And by day 15, he reached a point where the process no longer felt like something he was trying to survive. It felt like something he was starting to own, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but with a level of control he had never experienced before. And that was when he understood the third truth of the system, that discipline is not proven when things are difficult. It is proven when things become easy enough to ignore. And choosing not to ignore them is what separates temporary effort from lasting change. By day 16, the routine that once felt forced had become familiar, but instead of comfort, it brought a new kind of pressure, because now there was something to lose, something Ryan had built day by day that could disappear with a single decision. And that awareness followed him everywhere, turning small choices into meaningful ones. And for the first time, he felt the weight of consistency not as a burden, but as a responsibility. And that shift made him more alert, more intentional, but it also made him more vulnerable to one thing he had not fully faced yet: fatigue. Not physical exhaustion, but mental fatigue, the kind that builds quietly after repeated effort, where nothing feels urgent, but everything feels heavy. And on day 17 it hit him harder than before, not as resistance or doubt, but as a dull lack of energy, a sense that he was simply tired of showing up, tired of maintaining the standard, tired of thinking about what needed to be done every single day. And that kind of fatigue was dangerous because it did not argue or negotiate. It simply reduced his willingness to care. And for a moment he sat there, staring at the notebook, not wanting to quit, but not wanting to continue either, stuck in a space where both options felt equally distant. And that was when he realized something that had not been obvious before: that the method was not designed to eliminate discomfort. It was designed to train him to act in spite of it. And that realization forced him to simplify everything, to remove the expectation of feeling ready, of feeling motivated, and instead focus on one thing: the next action, not the entire goal, not the outcome, just the next step he had committed to. And when he did that, something shifted again. The weight of the process reduced, not because it became easier, but because it became clearer. And he moved forward, slowly at first, then steadily, completing the task without overthinking it. And when he finished, the fatigue was still there, but it no longer controlled his behavior. And that was new, because before this, his actions had always followed his feelings, but now his actions were beginning to lead. And by day 18, he noticed that same pattern repeating: moments of low energy, moments of distraction. But each time he returned to the same principle: reduce the process to one action and complete it. And that consistency began to build something deeper than habit. It built trust, not in the system, but in himself. Trust that he would follow through even when it was inconvenient, even when it felt repetitive. And that trust created a quiet confidence that did not depend on results. And by day 19, he started to see the accumulation of his effort more clearly. Tasks that once felt disconnected were now forming a pattern. Progress that once felt invisible was now measurable. And it was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. And that was enough to reinforce the process, to make the repetition feel meaningful instead of mechanical. And by day 20 he reached a point where the method revealed its next truth: that discipline is not about intensity or even consistency alone. It is about sustainability, about creating a structure that you can maintain regardless of how you feel. And Ryan understood that if he could continue at this pace, without burning out, without breaking the rule, then the outcome was no longer something he had to chase. It was something that would inevitably meet him. And for the first time in a long time, that thought did not feel like hope. It felt like certainty. By day 21, the process no longer felt like something Ryan was chasing. It felt like something he was protecting. And that distinction changed how he approached every moment. Because now the goal was not just to complete the day. It was to preserve the chain he had built, to defend the version of himself that had shown up consistently for 3 weeks straight. And that mindset made him sharper, more aware of the small decisions that used to slip by unnoticed. But it also introduced a new kind of pressure, the pressure of expectation, not from others, but from himself. Because now he had proof of what he was capable of, and that proof raised the standard, making anything less feel unacceptable. And on day 22 that pressure started to weigh on him, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle tension that followed him through the day, a sense that he had to perform at the same level, that he could not afford to slow down. And for a moment he mistook that pressure for progress, thinking it meant he was pushing himself further. But as the day went on, he realized something important: that pressure, if left unchecked, could turn discipline into stress, and stress into burnout. And that was not what the system was built for. And that realization forced him to adjust his perspective, not the structure of the method, but the way he approached it. Understanding that consistency did not mean intensity every single day. It meant showing up at a sustainable level, even when that level felt lower than before. And that shift allowed him to continue without forcing unnecessary strain. And by day 23, he felt more balanced, more in control, not because the work had changed, but because his relationship with it had, and that balance made the process feel more stable, less like something he had to survive, and more like something he could maintain long term. And then day 24 tested him in a different way, not through fatigue or pressure, but through disruption, an unexpected change in his schedule that forced him out of his routine, something that would have completely broken his consistency in the past, because he relied too heavily on perfect conditions. But now the rules still applied. Miss one day, and you start over, and that forced him to adapt, to find a way to complete his task within a limited window, without the comfort of his usual environment. And it was not ideal, it was not smooth, but it was done, and that was what mattered, because it proved that the method was not dependent on circumstances, it was dependent on commitment. And by day 25 Ryan understood something deeper than he had before, that the system was not just building habits or discipline, it was building flexibility within structure, the ability to maintain consistency even when conditions were not perfect, and that realization gave him a new level of confidence, not in his ability to control his environment, but in his ability to act regardless of it. And that was when the method revealed another truth, that real progress is not measured by how well you perform under ideal conditions, but by how consistently you show up when those conditions are taken away. And Ryan could feel that shift clearly now. He was no longer the person waiting for the right moment to act. He was becoming the person who created progress in any moment. And that identity was starting to feel real. By day 26, Ryan could feel the finish line approaching. But instead of relief, it brought a new kind of tension, the kind that builds when something important is close but not yet secured. And that tension made every action feel heavier, more deliberate, because now there was something at stake, not just the outcome, but the proof of who he had become over the past weeks. And on day 27, that pressure began to test him in ways he had not experienced before, not through resistance or fatigue, but through doubt, a quiet voice questioning whether he could actually sustain this to the end, whether he would make a mistake at the last moment and lose everything he had built. And that thought lingered longer than he expected, because the closer he got to completing the cycle, the more aware he became of how fragile it still was, how one missed action could reset everything. And for a moment he felt the urge to slow down, to play it safe, to reduce the effort just to ensure he did not fail. But something about that instinct felt wrong, because it was rooted in fear, not discipline. And he realized that finishing the process was not about protecting himself from failure. It was about continuing to act with the same consistency that had brought him this far. And so he stayed with the structure, completing the task exactly as he had every other day, not more, not less. And that decision steadied him, reminding him that the method did not change near the end. It remained the same from day 1 to day 30. And by day 28 he began to see the full picture more clearly, the accumulation of his actions forming something tangible, something that could not be dismissed as temporary effort. And for the first time he allowed himself to acknowledge the progress, not in a way that distracted him, but in a way that reinforced the process, showing him that consistency over time creates results that intensity alone never could. And on day 29 the final test revealed itself, not as a major obstacle, but as something far more subtle, the temptation to relax just before the finish line, to assume that the outcome was already secured, that one small compromise would not undo everything. And that was the most dangerous moment of all, because it did not feel like a risk, it felt like a reward, and Ryan recognized it immediately, because he had seen this pattern before in his life, getting close to something meaningful and then easing up too soon, losing momentum at the exact moment it mattered most. And this time he refused to repeat it, not because of the result, but because of what it would say about who he was. And so he completed the day with the same level of commitment as the first. No shortcuts, no adjustments. And when he closed the notebook that night, there was no sense of relief, only focus, because he understood that the final day was not a celebration. It was a confirmation, a moment that would reveal whether everything he had done up to this point was real or temporary. And as he prepared for day 30, Ryan realized that the outcome was no longer uncertain. The only question left was whether he would finish the same way he started, with a decision to follow through no matter what. Day 30 did not feel like a finish line. It felt like a test, a quiet, steady moment where everything Ryan had done over the past month came down to one final decision, not a dramatic action or a big leap, but the same simple commitment he had repeated every day. And that was what made it different from anything he had tried before, because there was no shortcut, no surge of motivation, no external push, just the structure he had followed since day one and the person he had become by choosing it again and again. And when he sat down that morning, there was a calm he had not felt before, not because the work was easy, but because the decision was already made. And as he moved through the task, step by step, there was no hesitation, no negotiation, only execution. And when he finished, he did not feel overwhelmed with excitement or relief. He felt something quieter, something deeper, a sense of alignment between what he said he would do and what he actually did. And that feeling was more powerful than any result, because it was not temporary, it was not dependent on circumstances, it was built through repetition, through consistency, through every moment he chose to follow through when it would have been easier not to. And as he closed the notebook, he realized that the goal he had set at the beginning was no longer the most important part of the process, because the real outcome was not what he achieved, it was who he had become in achieving it, someone who no longer relied on motivation, someone who no longer waited for the right moment, someone who acted regardless of how he felt. And that realization stayed with him as he walked back to the workshop, the same place where everything had started, expecting to see Ethan, to tell him that he had done it, that he had followed the rule all the way through. But when he opened the door, the space was empty, the tools neatly arranged, the air still carrying that familiar scent of wood and quiet focus. But there was no sign of Ethan, no explanation, no final instruction, only a single piece of wood resting on the workbench, and carved into it were a few simple words, clear and deliberate. Now you build your own life. And Ryan stood there for a moment, reading it again, understanding what it meant, that the method was never meant to be something he depended on forever. It was meant to change him into someone who could create his own structure, his own discipline, his own path forward. And as he stepped back out into the day, there was no dramatic transformation, no sudden change in the world around him. But there was a quiet certainty within him that had not been there before, a certainty that whatever goal came next, whatever challenge appeared, he would not approach it the way he used to, because now he knew something he had never truly understood before, that the difference between who he was and who he could become was not time, not talent, not luck, it was the decision to show up every single day and follow through.